Good evening. Tonight, we're going to trace the journey of a substance that began as one of the greatest pharmaceutical breakthroughs of the 20th century and somehow transformed into a teenager's ticket to terrifying hallucinations, emergency room visits, and in some tragic cases, death. This isn't a story about street drugs or cartel violence. This is a story about a pink pill you can buy at any gas station, a medication sitting in your medicine cabinet right now, trusted by millions of parents and recommended by doctors for generations. Before we begin this journey together, if you find value in these investigations into the hidden dangers lurking in plain sight, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, settle in. What you're about to hear may change how you look at over-the-counter medications forever, and it may save someone's life. To understand Benadryl, we must first understand the problem it was designed to solve. For most of human history, allergies were a mystery wrapped in suffering. People sneezed uncontrollably when flowers bloomed. Their eyes watered and swelled shut. Rashes appeared on their skin for no apparent reason. Sometimes their throats constricted after eating certain foods or being stung by insects, and they died gasping for air. But no one understood why. There was no framework for understanding what we now call the immune system, no concept of histamine, no explanation for why the body would attack harmless substances like pollen or dust, as if they were deadly invaders threatening survival. The ancient Greeks called it antipathy, an inexplicable hostility between certain substances and certain bodies. Medieval physicians thought it was an imbalance of the humours, the bodily fluids they believed governed health. By the Victorian era, hay fever had become so common among the upper classes that it was considered almost fashionable, a mark of refinement and sensitivity. Charles Darwin suffered from it. Marcel Proust was nearly incapacitated by it, but still, no one knew what actually caused these reactions or how to stop them. The breakthrough came in 1910, when two British physiologists, Henry Dale and George Barger, were conducting experiments with ergot, a fungus that grows on rye, and had been used for centuries to induce labour and treat bleeding. Working in a laboratory at the Wellcome Physiological Research Laboratories in London, they isolated a compound they called histamine, derived from the Greek word for tissue. They found that when injected into animals, histamine caused a dramatic and terrifying response. Blood vessels dilated suddenly, causing blood pressure to plummet. Airways constricted, making breathing difficult. Smooth muscles throughout the body contracted violently. The animals showed every sign of what we now call anaphylactic shock, that terrifying allergic reaction that can kill a person within minutes of exposure to a trigger. Dale and Barger had discovered one of the most important signalling molecules in the human body, though they didn't yet know it. For years, histamine remained a laboratory curiosity, a chemical that could produce dramatic effect when injected, but whose role in normal physiology was unclear. Then, in the 1920s, researchers made the crucial discovery. Histamine wasn't just an exotic compound from fungus. It was produced naturally in the human body, stored in specialized cells throughout our tissues waiting to be released. The cells that store histamine are called mast cells, and they're part of our immune system's first line of defense. When tissue is damaged by a cut, a burn, an infection, mast cells rupture like tiny grenades, releasing their payload of histamine into the surrounding tissue. This histamine then binds to receptors on nearby cells, triggering the inflammatory response we're all familiar with: redness, heat, swelling, pain. It's the body's alarm system, calling immune cells to the site of damage and increasing blood flow to deliver them there. This is a perfectly functional system when it's responding to actual threats. The problem is that in some people, this alarm system has a hair trigger. It goes off in response to harmless substances, pollen, dust mites, certain foods, animal dander, insect venom. The immune system mistakes these innocuous substances for dangerous invaders and launches a full defensive response. Mast cells release their histamine, blood vessels dilate, mucous membranes swell, airways constrict. The person sneezes, their nose runs, their eyes water and itch, their skin breaks out in hives. In severe cases, their throat swells shut and they can't breathe. By the 1930s, scientists understood the mechanism. Histamine was the trigger. The allergic response was the result of histamine binding to receptors and initiating a cascade of physiological changes. The logic was straightforward and elegant. If histamine causes allergic reactions, then blocking histamine should stop those reactions. If you could create a drug that would sit in the histamine receptors and prevent the real histamine from binding, you could, in theory, prevent the entire allergic response. The race was on. Pharmaceutical companies and university laboratories around the world pursued this goal with intense focus. Dozens of research teams synthesized thousands of compounds, methodically modifying chemical structures, testing them on animals, searching for the magic molecule that would block histamine without causing unacceptable side effects. The potential market was enormous. Millions of people suffered from allergies, and there was no effective treatment. Whoever discovered a working antihistamine would not only advance medical science, but also make a fortune. The breakthrough came in France in 1937. A chemist named Daniel Beauvais, working at the Pasteur Institute in Paris, synthesized the first compound with genuine antihistamine properties. He called it Antigan, and while it worked, it did block histamine receptors in animal tests. It had serious problems. It was toxic in doses only slightly higher than the therapeutic dose, giving it a dangerously narrow therapeutic window, and it caused sedation so profound that patients could barely function. People who took it to stop their sneezing found themselves falling asleep at their desks, unable to drive, unable to work. It was a proof of concept, not a practical medication. But it showed the world that antihistamines were possible, that the theory was sound, and that somewhere out there was a compound that would work better. Beauvais's work triggered an explosion of research. His paper was published, and immediately pharmaceutical companies around the world began synthesizing variations of his basic chemical structure. They were tweaking molecules atom by atom, adding chemical groups here, removing them there, systematically exploring the vast chemical space around Antigan's structure. It was a monumental effort, a pharmaceutical Manhattan project spread across dozens of laboratories with thousands of scientists working simultaneously on the same problem. Each company hoped theirs would be the one to strike gold, to find the antihistamine that would be safe enough and effective enough to bring to market. The winner, as it turned out, was an American company called Parke-Davis, one of the oldest and most prestigious pharmaceutical firms in the United States. A company that had already given the world medications like adrenaline and a host of other breakthrough drugs. And the chemist who made the discovery was a man named George Revachol Jr., a brilliant young professor who would become a millionaire from his creation, and whose name would be forgotten by history, even as his drug became a household staple. George Revachol Jr. was born in 1916 in Cincinnati, Ohio, the son of German immigrants who had come to America seeking opportunity. His father worked as a tool and die maker. skilled manual labour that paid the bills but offered little in the way of advancement or security. Young George showed an early aptitude for science and mathematics, the kind of focused intelligence that teachers recognise and encourage. He excelled in school, earned scholarships, and in 1932 enrolled at the University of Cincinnati to study chemistry. The timing was terrible. The Great Depression had devastated the American economy. Banks had failed, businesses had collapsed, unemployment had soared above 25%. Millions of Americans were out of work, standing in bread lines, losing their homes. For a working-class kid trying to get through college, these were brutal years. Revachol worked multiple jobs to pay his tuition. He washed dishes, he worked in laboratories, he did whatever was necessary to stay in school. But he was brilliant and driven, and he pushed through, earning his bachelor's degree in 1937 and his doctorate in 1940 at just 24 years old. A remarkable achievement for someone of his background in that era. He joined the faculty at the University of Cincinnati as an assistant professor, teaching chemistry to undergraduates while pursuing his own research. But academic salaries were low, especially for junior faculty, and Revachol had ambitions beyond the classroom. He began consulting for pharmaceutical companies, offering his expertise in organic chemistry in exchange for research funding and the chance to work on practical problems. One of his clients was Parke Davis, the Detroit-based pharmaceutical giant that was always looking for talented chemists who could help them develop new drugs. In the early 1940s, as World War II raged across Europe and the Pacific, Parke Davis tasked Revachol with developing new synthetic drugs that might have military applications. The war had created urgent demand for medications that could treat casualties, prevent disease, and keep soldiers fighting. One of Revachol's projects was to create muscle relaxants that could help treat shock and trauma on the battlefield. He was working in a class of chemicals called ethanolamines, systematically synthesizing variations and testing them to see what effects they produced. The work was painstaking and methodical. Organic chemistry in the 1940s was not what it is today. There were no computers to model molecular structures, no automated synthesis machines. Everything was done by hand, mixing reagents in glassware, carefully controlling temperatures, isolating and purifying products through crystallization and distillation. Each new compound required days or weeks of work, and most of them turned out to be useless. Either they didn't work at all, or they worked but had unacceptable toxicity, or they had some other fatal flaw that made them impractical. But Revachol was systematic and persistent. He kept detailed notebooks recording every synthesis, every test result, every observation. And in 1943 he synthesized compound number 1645. It was a crystalline white powder with a structure similar to other drugs he'd been working on, but with one key difference. It had two benzene rings attached to a central carbon, connected through an ether linkage to a dimethylaminoethanol group. The structure was elegant in its simplicity, just 17 carbon atoms, 21 hydrogens, 1 nitrogen and 1 oxygen, arranged in a specific three-dimensional configuration. When tested on guinea pigs that had been sensitized to allergens, compound 1645 showed powerful antihistamine effects. The animals that received the drug before allergen exposure showed dramatically reduced allergic responses compared to control animals. More importantly, the compound seemed to have a much better safety profile than Antigan or any of the other antihistamines that had been developed so far. The dose that produced therapeutic effects was far below the dose that caused toxic effects. There was a wide margin of safety. Revachol had created diphenhydramine, though he didn't call it that yet. At the time, It was just one of hundreds of compounds he'd synthesized, distinguished only by the fact that it seemed to work better than the others. But Parke-Davis immediately recognized the potential. This was the antihistamine they'd been searching for, the drug that could finally provide safe, effective relief from allergies. The company filed for a patent in 1944, listing Revachol as the inventor. They began the laborious process of testing the drug more extensively, first in animals to establish dosing and safety parameters, then in small groups of human volunteers, then in larger clinical trials. The early human trials were promising. Diphenhydramine blocked histamine receptors effectively, providing relief from hay fever, hives, and other allergic conditions. Yes, it caused drowsiness. That was unavoidable given how the drug worked, but not as severely as the earlier antihistamines, and the therapeutic window was much wider. A person would have to take many times the recommended dose before experiencing serious toxicity. In 1946, after the war had ended and the world was returning to some semblance of normalcy, the FDA approved diphenhydramine for over-the-counter sale. This was a significant decision. The FDA could have required it to be prescription only, which would have limited its availability and required doctor supervision. But based on the safety data, they determined that it was safe enough for self-medication. People could diagnose their own allergies and treat them without medical oversight. Parke-Davis marketed the drug under the brand name Benadryl, a name allegedly chosen to suggest both beneficial and dryal, evoking dryness, since the drug dried up the watery eyes and runny noses of allergy sufferers. The marketing campaign was extensive and aggressive. Advertisements appeared in medical journals, in popular magazines, on radio. The message was simple and appealing. Finally, relief from allergies without prescription, without a doctor's visit, available at any pharmacy. The launch was a sensation. Americans, exhausted by years of war and eager for modern conveniences and medical advances, embraced Benadryl enthusiastically. Sales exploded. Within a few years, Benadryl was generating millions of dollars in revenue for Parke-Davis, making it one of the most successful drug launches of the post-war era. And George Revachol, who had wisely negotiated to receive royalties on the drug rather than accepting a one-time payment, became a very wealthy man. The royalty checks that arrived each quarter transformed his life. He remained at the University of Cincinnati, teaching and researching, but he was now a millionaire, able to pursue his interests without financial worry. For Parke-Davis and for Revachol, Benadryl was a triumph. But the story was just beginning, because diphenhydramine, it turned out, was not just an antihistamine. It had other properties, other effects on the brain and body that would make it far more than just an allergy medication. Some of those effects would prove useful, others would prove dangerous, and none of them were fully understood at the time the drug was released to the public. Almost immediately after Benadryl's release, doctors began discovering that it was useful for far more than just allergies. The drowsiness that was a side effect for allergy patients turned out to be a primary benefit for people with insomnia. In an era before modern sleep medications, when the main options were barbiturates, which were dangerously addictive and easy to overdose on, or alcohol, Benadryl offered a relatively safe way to help people fall asleep. The mechanism made sense. Histamine in the brain is one of several neurotransmitters involved in maintaining wakefulness and alertness. Block histamine receptors in the brain, and you promote sleep. Parke-Davis began marketing Benadryl not just for allergies but also as a sleep aid, particularly for people with occasional insomnia. And millions of Americans, chronically sleep-deprived in an increasingly fast-paced society, began taking it nightly to help them rest. Parents discovered another use. Benadryl could calm restless children. A dose of the pink liquid before a long car trip or airplane flight would help fidgety kids settle down and often fall asleep, making travel vastly easier for exhausted parents. Pediatricians began recommending it routinely. The practice became so common that Benadryl was essentially a standard part of the parenting toolkit in the 1950s and 60s, as normal as giving a child aspirin for a fever. The medical community also found that Benadryl was effective for motion sickness and nausea. The inner ear's balance system interacts with histamine signaling, and blocking histamine reduces the nausea and dizziness associated with motion. Sailors, pilots, and travelers began using it to prevent seasickness and airsickness. It became part of the standard medical kit for military personnel. Then doctors noticed something peculiar. Benadryl seemed to reduce tremors and muscle stiffness in patients with Parkinson's disease. This wasn't its intended use, and at first it seemed like a random, inexplicable side effect. But researchers eventually figured out why. Diphenhydramine doesn't just block histamine receptors, it's also a powerful blocker of muscarinic acetylcholine receptors. And Parkinson's disease involves an imbalance between dopamine and acetylcholine in the brain. By blocking acetylcholine, Benadryl could partially correct that imbalance and provide symptomatic relief. This anticholinergic property would prove to be both a blessing and a curse. It made Benadryl useful for treating drug-induced movement disorders, particularly the tremors and muscle rigidity caused by antipsychotic medications that were coming into wide use in the 1950s. Psychiatric hospitals began stocking Benadryl and administering it routinely to patients on antipsychotics to manage these side effects. But anticholinergic drugs have their own side effects, a constellation of symptoms that medical students learn with a memorable rhyme. Blind as a bat, mad as a hatter, red as a beet, hot as a hare, dry as a bone. The bowel and bladder lose their tone and the heart runs alone. At therapeutic doses, these effects are mild. Perhaps some dry mouth, a bit of blurred vision, maybe constipation. But at higher doses, they become pronounced and dangerous. Through the 1950s and 60s, this didn't seem like a major concern. Benadryl was being used exactly as intended by millions of people, and serious problems were rare. There were occasional cases of children overdosing after getting into the medicine cabinet and consuming large quantities of the pleasant-tasting pink liquid. Emergency room doctors treated these cases and documented them in the medical literature. The symptoms were disturbing but predictable: agitation, confusion, hallucinations, rapid heartbeat, flushed skin, dilated pupils, in severe cases seizures and coma. A few children died, but these were viewed as accidents, the tragic result of parental negligence or childhood curiosity. No one imagined that people would deliberately overdose on Benadryl to experience those effects. Why would they? The overdose state was terrifying, not pleasurable. There was no euphoria, no rush, no pleasant high. Just confusion, fear, and hallucinations that resembled a nightmare more than anything anyone would seek out intentionally. Medical researchers in this era were also beginning to study diphenhydramine's effects on memory and cognition. Even at normal doses, the drug impaired memory formation slightly. This made sense given acetylcholine's crucial role in learning and memory, but it wasn't considered a major concern. The impairment was mild and temporary, resolving once the drug was metabolized and cleared from the system. By 1970, Benadryl and its generic equivalents had become one of the most widely used over-the-counter medications in America. It was sold under dozens of brand names, included in combination cold and flu products, marketed in various formulations for various purposes. The patent had expired, allowing generic manufacturers to produce diphenhydramine cheaply, driving prices down and availability up. You could buy it at any pharmacy, any grocery store, any gas station. It was as ubiquitous as aspirin, as familiar as Coca-Cola. For George Reeveshall, watching his creation become a household staple must have been immensely satisfying. He had solved a real medical problem, improved millions of lives, and made himself wealthy in the process. The American dream realized through scientific innovation. He continued teaching at the University of Cincinnati, became a prominent figure in the local community, donated generously to educational causes. His discovery had secured his legacy. But beneath this veneer of success and safety, the seeds of a future crisis were being planted. Because diphenhydramine, in addition to all its therapeutic effects, had another property that wouldn't become widely known until the internet age. At very high doses, it was a powerful deliriant, capable of producing hallucinations and altered states of consciousness, unlike anything else readily available to the public. For decades, this property of diphenhydramine remained obscure knowledge, known primarily to toxicologists, emergency room physicians, and a small subculture of people experimenting with consciousness-altering substances. The information existed, but was not widely disseminated. If you wanted to know what happened when you took a massive overdose of Benadryl, you would need to either experience it yourself, know someone who had, or have access to medical literature that most people never consulted. In the 1970s and 80s, there was a small but persistent trickle of reports in medical journals about deliberate diphenhydramine intoxication. Psychiatrists treating patients in mental hospitals would occasionally observe someone who had hoarded their Benadryl, given for medication side effects, and consumed it all at once, producing a dramatic delirium. Poison control centers fielded calls about teenagers who had raided medicine cabinets, looking for something to get high on, and had discovered that massive doses of Benadryl produced altered states. The descriptions in these case reports were consistent and disturbing. Patients experienced visual and auditory hallucinations that were completely convincing. They couldn't distinguish them from reality. They saw insects crawling on walls and skin. They saw people who weren't there and held conversations with these phantom figures. They experienced profound confusion and amnesia, unable to remember what they'd just done or said. They engaged in repetitive, purposeless behaviors, picking up invisible objects, smoking phantom cigarettes, having the same conversation multiple times without remembering the previous iterations. The medical term for this state is anticholinergic delirium, and it's recognized as one of the most unpleasant and frightening drug-induced states possible. Unlike hallucinogens like LSD or psilocybin, which produce perceptual distortions and alterations while generally preserving some sense of reality testing, anticholinergic deliriants completely obliterate the boundary between real and unreal. The hallucinations are not recognized as hallucinations. They are experienced as absolutely real, which creates a terrifying sense of confusion and loss of control when the person realizes, usually after the fact, that none of what they experience was actually happening. In the counterculture drug scene of the 1960s and 70s, diphenhydramine was occasionally mentioned as a deliriant grouped with substances like datura, belladonna, and other anticholinergic plants that had been used in shamanic practices and witchcraft for thousands of years. But it never gained popularity in that scene. The psychonauts and consciousness explorers of that era were seeking transcendence, cosmic insights, ego dissolution, mystical experiences. What diphenhydramine offered was confusion, terror, and amnesia. It was antithetical to the psychedelic ethos. The people who did use diphenhydramine recreationally in this era tended to be those with limited access to other drugs, or those specifically seeking oblivion rather than enlightenment. Inmates in prisons and psychiatric hospitals who had no access to street drugs would sometimes abuse whatever medications they could obtain, including Benadryl. Teenagers in isolated rural areas with no connection to drug dealers might experiment with it out of curiosity or desperation. But these were isolated cases, not a widespread phenomenon. The information about diphenhydramine's deliriant effects circulated primarily by word of mouth within small subcultures. There was no mass media coverage, no public health campaigns warning about it, because it simply wasn't common enough to register as a significant problem. Then came the 1990s and the birth of the internet, and everything changed. The early internet, before social media and smartphones, was primarily text-based and community-driven. People gathered in forums, newsgroups, and early websites built by enthusiasts who wanted to share information about specific topics. One of those topics was drugs and consciousness alteration. In 1995, two activists named Fire Erowid and Earth Erowid launched erowid.org, a website dedicated to providing accurate, non-judgmental information about psychoactive substances. Their mission was harm reduction through education. They believed that people would use drugs regardless of legal status or official warnings, and that providing honest, detailed information about effects, dosages, and risks would help people make safer choices than they would if operating in ignorance. Erowid solicited and published thousands of first-person experience reports, detailed narratives written by people describing their experiences with various substances. These trip reports, as they became known, were remarkably candid. People described not just the pleasant or interesting aspects of their experiences, but also the difficult, frightening, and dangerous elements. The reports were tagged with dosage information, route of administration, the person's body weight and previous drug experience, and a rating of the overall experience. Among these thousands of reports were accounts of diphenhydramine intoxication. The earliest ones appeared in the late 1990s, and they were almost universally negative. A typical report might read something like this. Dose: 300 mg diphenhydramine, 12 tablets. Setting: my bedroom alone. I took the pills around 9 p.m. Within an hour, I started feeling heavy and confused. My mouth became completely dry. I couldn't focus my eyes. By 10 p.m., I was seeing things that I knew weren't real, but looked completely solid and three-dimensional. Spiders crawling on my walls, shadow figures standing in corners. I tried to grab a cigarette from my pack, but when I put it to my lips, it vanished. This happened over and over. I kept forgetting I'd already tried. The worst part was the conversations. I was talking to my friend who I thought was in the room with me. We had a whole conversation about going to get food. Then I turned around and realized I was alone. I'd been talking to nobody for 20 minutes. This terrified me because I couldn't tell what was real anymore. I spent the next 6 hours in a nightmare state. Every time I thought I understood what was happening, I'd forget and get confused again. I kept trying to do normal things, check my phone, get water, but my coordination was shot and my memory was gone. I couldn't complete a single task. When I finally started coming down around 4 a.m., I was exhausted and scared. My heart was racing. My body ached. I felt like I'd been awake for days. The worst experience of my life. Never again. Not worth it in any way. 0/5 stars. Would not recommend to anyone ever. Hundreds of reports like this accumulated on Erowid and similar sites through the late 1990s and 2000s. They were remarkably consistent in describing a deeply unpleasant, frightening experience characterized by convincing hallucinations, profound confusion, amnesia, and physical discomfort. Almost every report ended with some variation of "never again" or "worst experience of my life." But here's the paradox. The very existence of these reports, even when uniformly negative, served as a kind of advertisement. They confirmed that yes, you could get a powerful hallucinogenic experience from a legal substance available at any drugstore. For some people, particularly curious teenagers, the warnings became invitations. The fact that the experience was described as terrible didn't necessarily deter them. In fact, for some, it made it more intriguing. How bad could it really be? Were people exaggerating? Maybe they just took too much. Maybe I would have a different experience. This is a well-documented phenomenon in drug culture. Warnings can paradoxically increase curiosity and experimentation, particularly among adolescents whose brains are wired to seek novel experiences and who tend to have an optimism bias. The belief that bad outcomes happen to other people, not to them. Additionally, the detailed information about dosages provided a roadmap that hadn't existed before. Prior to the internet, if you wanted to experiment with Benadryl, you had to guess at a dose. You might take too little and experience nothing, or too much and end up in the emergency room. The trip reports provided specific information. 200 to 300 milligrams seemed to be the threshold for hallucinogenic effects. 400 to 500 milligrams was a strong dose. Above that, you were risking serious medical complications. For better or worse, the internet had democratized knowledge about drug effects. Information that had previously been locked in medical literature or passed by word of mouth within small subcultures was now freely available to anyone with an internet connection. And as internet access spread through the 2000s, from desktop computers to laptops to smartphones, that information became accessible to ever younger audiences. By 2010, discussions of diphenhydramine abuse had spread beyond specialized drug information sites to general internet forums. Reddit threads appeared with people asking about DPH trips, using the abbreviation for diphenhydramine, and sharing their experiences. YouTube videos showed people documenting their intoxication, though these were relatively rare and not widely viewed. The phenomenon remained niche but persistent. Poison. Control centers reported steady, low-level rates of intentional diphenhydramine overdoses among teenagers and young adults. Emergency rooms in every part of the country saw occasional cases, but it wasn't epidemic. It wasn't a crisis. It was a concerning trend documented in medical literature and public health reports, but not something that demanded urgent action or major policy changes. Then came TikTok, and the scale changed completely. TikTok launched internationally in 2018 and grew with stunning speed, particularly among teenagers and young adults. By 2020, it had over 800 million active users worldwide, with its highest usage among people under 24. The platform's algorithm was extraordinarily sophisticated, learning what each user liked and serving them an endless stream of similar content. This created feedback loops where niche interests could explode into mainstream trends within days or even hours. The platform's format, short videos, usually 15 to 60 seconds, set to music and designed for easy sharing, was perfectly optimized for viral spread. A trend that started with a few thousand people could reach millions within a week. And crucially, the algorithm didn't just show you content from people you followed. It showed you content from anyone, anywhere, based on what you'd engaged with before. This meant that teenagers in suburban Ohio were seeing content from teenagers in Los Angeles or London or Sydney, all mixed together in an endless addictive feed. In the spring and summer of 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic locked much of the world indoors, TikTok usage exploded. Teenagers, stuck at home with online school and no social contact, spent hours each day scrolling through their feeds. The platform became their primary social world, their entertainment, their window to what their peers across the globe were doing, and what some of their peers were doing, it turned out, was the Benadryl challenge. The challenge was simple in concept. Take a large dose of Benadryl, film yourself experiencing the effects, and post it for views and likes. The recommended dose varied, but most posts suggested 12 to 15 tablets, 300 to 375 milligrams, roughly 12 to 15 times the standard 25 milligrams allergy dose. The videos that resulted were disturbing to watch. They showed teenagers becoming increasingly disoriented and confused. Some wandered around their rooms picking at things that weren't there. Some stared blankly at the camera with massively dilated pupils, barely able to speak coherently. Some talked to people who weren't present. Some exhibited jerky, uncoordinated movements as they tried and failed to complete simple tasks. Some just looked terrified, their faces showing the panic of someone who's lost control and doesn't understand what's happening to them. The comment sections on these videos were a mix of concern, mockery, and encouragement. Some commenters warned against doing the challenge, sharing their own bad experiences or medical information about the dangers. Others egged people on, treating it like entertainment, asking for more videos. Still others shared tips on dosing or how to handle the experience. TikTok's algorithm, immoral and mechanical, simply served more of whatever generated engagement. And the Benadryl challenge videos generated tremendous engagement. They were shocking, they were novel, they tapped into adolescent fascination with altered consciousness and risk-taking. So the algorithm pushed them to more users who engaged with them, which told the algorithm to push them to even more users. The hashtag Benadryl challenge accumulated millions of views. Teenagers who had never heard of diphenhydramine abuse were suddenly seeing dozens of videos about it. The challenge spread like wildfire across the platform and jumped to other social media, Instagram, YouTube, Snapchat, Discord servers where teenagers gathered to chat. And then the death started. In August 2020, 15-year-old girl in Oklahoma City named Chloe Phillips died after taking a large dose of Benadryl as part of the TikTok challenge. According to news reports, she had been watching videos about the challenge and decided to try it. Her family found her unresponsive. She was rushed to the hospital but died a few days later. The autopsy listed diphenhydramine toxicity as the cause of death. She was not the first teenager to die from diphenhydramine overdose. That had been happening sporadically for decades. But she was the first whose death was directly and publicly linked to the TikTok challenge, and her death became a news story that was picked up nationally. Suddenly, the Benadryl challenge was no longer just an internet curiosity. It was a public health crisis. Emergency rooms across the country reported surges in diphenhydramine overdoses among teenagers in the summer and fall of 2020. Doctors in cities from coast to coast saw the same pattern. Previously healthy teenagers showing up in the ER with tachycardia, dilated pupils, confusion, hallucinations and seizures. When questioned, they or their friends admitted they had taken large amounts of Benadryl because of something they saw on TikTok. In September 2020, the FDA issued an official public warning, specifically calling out the Benadryl challenge by name. The warning stated, "We are aware of news reports of teenagers ending up in emergency rooms or dying after participating in the Benadryl challenge encouraged in videos posted on the social media application TikTok. We are investigating these reports and conducting a review to determine if additional cases have been reported. We will update the public once we have completed our review or have more information to share. The statement continued. Taking higher than recommended doses of the common over-the-counter OTC allergy medicine diphenhydramine, Benadryl, can lead to serious heart problems, seizures, coma, or even death. TikTok responded by banning content related to the Benadryl challenge. They removed videos with the hashtag, blocked searches for related terms, and added warning screens when people tried to search for the content. But as with all attempts to suppress information on the internet, the effort was only partially successful. The challenge migrated to private groups, to other platforms, to coded language and alternative hashtags. You couldn't kill it by removing it from one platform. It had already spread too far. Johnson & Johnson, which owned the Benadryl brand, issued its own statement warning against misuse and emphasizing that the product was safe when used as directed. Some retailers began placing limits on how many packages of diphenhydramine products a customer could purchase at once, similar to restrictions on cold medications containing pseudoephedrine. Parents and schools scrambled to respond. Many parents had no idea that Benadryl could be abused or that their teenagers were even aware of the challenge. Schools sent warnings home, urging parents to secure medications and talk to their children about the dangers of social media challenges, but the fundamental problem remained unsolved. Benadryl was still cheap, legal, and available everywhere. A teenager could walk into any drugstore, gas station, or grocery store and buy a bottle with no questions asked. No ID required, no age verification, no limits on purchase size in most places. For teenagers looking for a legal high that wouldn't show up on a drug test and didn't require knowing a dealer, diphenhydramine remained accessible, and the deaths continued. In December 2020, a 14-year-old boy in Texas died from diphenhydramine overdose after attempting the challenge. In early 2021, a 13-year-old boy in Ohio died. These weren't isolated incidents in one region. They were happening across the country, in suburbs and cities, in affluent communities and poor ones. The only common thread was TikTok and the viral spread of dangerous misinformation disguised as a challenge. To truly understand why the Benadryl challenge is so dangerous, and why the experiences described by users are so consistently terrifying, we need to dive deeper into what diphenhydramine does to the brain at high doses. This isn't a simple story of a drug that gets you high like alcohol or marijuana. This is a drug that fundamentally disrupts the brain's ability to distinguish between reality and imagination. The human brain operates through an intricate network of chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. These molecules carry signals between neurons, allowing different parts of the brain to communicate and coordinate. Each neurotransmitter has specific receptors it binds to, like a key fitting into a lock, and when that binding occurs, it triggers changes in the receiving neuron, making it more or less likely to fire, altering its chemistry, changing its behavior. Diphenhydramine primarily affects two neurotransmitter systems, histamine and acetylcholine. At therapeutic doses, the 25 to 50 milligrams you take for allergies, it blocks histamine H1 receptors. This prevents histamine from triggering the allergic response cascade. It also blocks these same receptors in the brain, where histamine is involved in maintaining wakefulness and attention. That's why Benadryl makes you drowsy, but diphenhydramine also blocks muscarinic acetylcholine receptors, and this is where things get dangerous at high doses. Acetylcholine is one of the most important and ubiquitous neurotransmitters in the nervous system. In the peripheral nervous system, the nerves throughout your body, It controls muscle contractions, heart rate, digestion, saliva production, pupil size, and numerous other automatic functions. In the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord, it's crucial for attention, learning, memory, and importantly, for distinguishing between internally generated thoughts and external sensory input. When you take a massive dose of diphenhydramine, 10 or 15 times the therapeutic dose, you overwhelm the acetylcholine system. The drug molecules flood into the brain and occupy the vast majority of muscarinic receptors, preventing the normal acetylcholine signaling from occurring. This produces what's called anticholinergic syndrome, a well-characterized medical condition with a constellation of specific symptoms. In the peripheral nervous system, the effects are dramatic and visible. The pupils dilate to maximum size because the muscles that constrict them are controlled by acetylcholine. Saliva production stops completely. The mouth becomes absolutely dry, sometimes to the point where swallowing is difficult. Sweat production ceases, and body temperature rises because sweating is a crucial cooling mechanism. The heart rate accelerates, sometimes to 130 or 140 beats per minute or higher, because acetylcholine normally acts as a brake on the heart. The intestines stop moving, causing constipation. The bladder loses tone, making urination difficult or impossible. These peripheral effects are uncomfortable and potentially dangerous. The elevated heart rate and body temperature can be life-threatening, but they're not what makes diphenhydramine intoxication so profoundly disturbing. That comes from what happens in the brain. Acetylcholine in the brain is involved in countless functions, but one of its crucial roles is in what neuroscientists call salience detection, the process by which your brain distinguishes between important and unimportant information, between real external stimuli and internal mental events. Your brain is constantly generating mental imagery. Right now, as you listen to this, your brain is creating images, memories, associations, predictions about what might happen next. Normally, you don't confuse these internal mental events with external reality. You know the difference between imagining a spider and seeing a spider, between remembering a conversation and having a conversation. This distinction depends on acetylcholine signaling. When acetylcholine circuits are functioning normally, they tag real sensory input as external and internally generated thoughts as internal. Your brain knows which is which. But when you block acetylcholine receptors massively, as happens with high-dose diphenhydramine, this tagging system breaks down. The brain loses the ability to distinguish between external sensations and internal imagery. Everything feels equally real. This is why diphenhydramine hallucinations are so convincing and so different from psychedelic hallucinations. When someone takes LSD or psilocybin, they typically maintain some awareness that they're hallucinating, that the walls aren't really breathing, that the colours aren't normally this vivid. There's a part of them that knows this is the drug. But with diphenhydramine, that meta-awareness disappears. When you see a person standing in your room, you completely believe they're there. You have a conversation with them. It doesn't occur to you to question whether they're real. Only later, when you turn around and they're gone, do you realize you've been talking to nobody. The hallucinations also tend to have specific recurring themes across users. Shadow people, dark humanoid figures at the edge of vision, are almost universally reported. So are spiders and other insects crawling on walls and skin. Translucent or phantom objects that vanish when touched are common. People report seeing cigarettes that aren't there, trying to smoke them repeatedly, forgetting each time that the cigarette isn't real. They see text messages on their phones that disappear. They have conversations with friends or family members who aren't present. Neuroscientists hypothesize that these common hallucination themes relate to primal fears and preoccupations embedded in the human brain. Spiders and shadowy figures represent threat detection systems gone haywire. The phantom cigarettes and repetitive behaviors may relate to disrupted motor planning circuits. But the honest answer is that we don't fully understand why diphenhydramine hallucinations take the specific forms they do. What we do know is that the experience is universally described as frightening and disorienting. Unlike psychedelics, which many users describe as insightful or even spiritual despite being challenging, diphenhydramine produces only confusion and terror. There's no cosmic insight, no sense of connectedness, no beautiful visuals, just the nightmare sensation of not being able to trust your own senses. The amnesia component makes it even worse. Acetylcholine is crucial for forming new memories, for transferring information from short-term to long-term storage. Block it severely, and you lose the ability to form new memories. This creates a situation where you're experiencing things, having conversations, moving around, doing things, but you can't remember doing them moments later. You get stuck in loops, asking the same questions over and over, picking up the same objects repeatedly, because each time you do, it feels like the first time. This is similar to what happens in Alzheimer's disease, where cholinergic neurons die and patients lose the ability to form new memories. It's one of the cruelest aspects of that disease, being trapped in an eternal present with no continuity. Diphenhydramine produces a temporary drug-induced version of this state. The physical effects compound the psychological terror. Your heart is racing. You can feel it pounding in your chest. Your mouth is desert dry no matter how much water you drink. You're hot and flushed. Your vision is blurry because your pupils are maximally dilated and can't adjust to focus. You're clumsy and uncoordinated, and you're utterly confused about what's happening to you. If you're lucky, you stay in a safe place and the effect gradually wear off over 8 to 12 hours as your liver metabolizes the drug. If you're unlucky, you have a seizure, or your heart develops an arrhythmia, or your body temperature rises to dangerous levels, or you wander outside and into traffic because you can't tell what's real. Dr. Sarah Chen has been an emergency physician at a large urban hospital in California for 15 years. In a conversation about the Benadryl challenge phenomenon, she described what it's like to treat these patients from a medical perspective. The first time I saw a Benadryl challenge case was in late 2020, she recalled. A 14-year-old girl was brought in by ambulance. She was profoundly confused, talking to people who weren't there, picking at invisible things on her skin. Her heart rate was 140. Her temperature was 102. Her pupils were huge. They looked like she'd been given dilating drops at the eye doctor. She kept trying to get off the gurney because she thought she needed to go somewhere, but she couldn't explain where or why. The paramedics had found empty Benadryl packets in her room, and her friend who was with her eventually admitted they'd been doing the TikTok challenge. She'd taken about 400 milligrams, 16 tablets. She was having a classic anticholinergic crisis. We started IV fluids, did an EKG to check her heart rhythm, gave her a benzodiazepine to reduce her agitation and lower her seizure risk. We put her on a cardiac monitor and watched her closely. The thing about anticholinergic toxicity is that there's no specific antidote we can safely give. There's a drug called physostigmine that can temporarily reverse the effects, but it's risky. It can cause seizures and other problems. We only use it in the most severe cases. So mostly we provide what we call supportive care. We keep them safe, we monitor their vital signs, we treat complications if they arise, and we wait for their liver to metabolize the drug. It usually takes 8 to 12 hours. The whole time the patient is confused and hallucinating. They try to leave. They pull at their IVs. They see things that aren't there. It's distressing for them, for their families, and frankly for us. That first patient recovered fine physically. After about 10 hours, she started to come back to reality. But she was traumatized. She kept crying and saying she didn't understand what had happened, that it felt like being trapped in a nightmare while awake. Her parents were devastated. They had no idea this was even possible with an over-the-counter allergy medication. Since then, I've seen maybe 24 cases. They all follow the same pattern. Teenager takes a large dose after seeing it on social media. Someone finds them acting bizarre and brings them in. We provide supportive care and hope they don't have complications. Most recover. But I've seen seizures. I've seen dangerous heart arrhythmias. I've seen body temperatures of 105 or 106 degrees that required aggressive cooling. One kid went into rhabdomyolysis. His muscles broke down from the agitation and hypothermia, and his kidneys nearly failed. What frustrates me is that these kids often have no idea what they're getting into. They see videos on TikTok that make it look interesting or funny, not realizing those videos don't show the full picture. They don't show the 8 hours of terrifying confusion. They don't show the hospital admission, the worried parents, the potential for serious harm. And from a public health perspective, I don't know what the solution is. You can't make Benadryl prescription only. Too many people use it legitimately. You can't restrict sales too much without creating barriers for people who need it. Education helps, but teenagers aren't known for making risk-averse decisions even when they have good information. What I tell parents is, lock up your medications, all of them, even over-the-counter ones. Talk to your kids about social media challenges and why they're dangerous. And if your teenager ever shows up, acting confused and strange, check for medications they might have taken and get them to an ER immediately. The medical literature on diphenhydramine toxicity has expanded significantly since 2020. Case reports have documented everything from mild intoxication to deaths. Poison control centers have published data showing sharp increases in calls about intentional diphenhydramine ingestion among adolescents, particularly in 2020 and 2021. A 2021 study published in the Journal of Medical Toxicology analyzed data from the National Poison Data System and found that intentional diphenhydramine exposures among teenagers increased by over 200% between 2019 and 2021. The study noted that the increase correlated temporally with the TikTok Benadryl challenge becoming viral, though proving causation is difficult. The deaths, while still relatively rare compared to the number of people who attempt the challenge, are tragic and entirely preventable. Autopsy reports typically show death from cardiac arrhythmia, the heart developing an abnormal rhythm due to diphenhydramine's effects on cardiac sodium channels, or from seizures that didn't respond to treatment, or from hypothermia causing multi-organ failure. In some cases, the mechanism of death is indirect. People in the throes of diphenhydramine delirium have walked into traffic, fallen from heights, drowned in bathtubs or pools, or engaged in other dangerous behaviors because their judgment was completely impaired and they couldn't distinguish reality from hallucination. Each death follows the same general pattern. A teenager decides to try the challenge, takes a large dose, experiences effects far more severe than anticipated, and either doesn't seek help or seeks it too late. By the time medical intervention is available, the damage is done. While the TikTok Benadryl challenge brought diphenhydramine abuse into mainstream awareness, It obscured a different, longer-standing pattern of abuse that had existed for decades, chronic use by adults, often with co-occurring mental health or substance use disorders. These chronic users represent a different population from the teenagers doing challenges. They're often older, frequently between 25 and 45. Many have histories of polysubstance abuse. They've used multiple drugs over the years, legal and illegal. Many have psychiatric diagnoses: schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe depression, PTSD, borderline personality disorder. Some have discovered diphenhydramine while in treatment programs, psychiatric hospitals, or prisons where access to traditional drugs for abuse is impossible, but over-the-counter medications may be available through infirmaries. The pattern typically starts innocently. Someone takes Benadryl for allergies or to help sleep. They notice the sedative effect and start taking more than recommended. Eventually, through experimentation or through hearing about it from others, they discover that very high doses produce altered states of consciousness. Despite the unpleasant nature of these states, and chronic users uniformly describe the experience as unpleasant, they continue using compulsively. Why would someone repeatedly subject themselves to terrifying hallucinations? The answer lies in understanding addiction not as the pursuit of pleasure but as the pursuit of escape. For someone whose baseline reality is unbearable, whether due to trauma, mental illness, chronic pain, or life circumstances, even an unpleasant altered state can be preferable to sobriety. Diphenhydramine doesn't provide euphoria, but it provides profound disconnection from reality. For someone whose reality is a constant source of suffering, that disconnection has value. Dr. Michael Torres, an addiction psychiatrist who has treated numerous patients with diphenhydramine dependence, explained the psychology. These are often people who have tried everything else and found that nothing helps. Traditional substance abuse treatment hasn't worked. Psychiatric medications haven't worked. Therapy hasn't worked. They're deeply, profoundly suffering, and they've learned that Benadryl, for all its horrors, provides a kind of temporary relief. The hallucinations, the confusion, these become familiar. A patient once told me, "I know the shadow people aren't real. I've seen them so many times that they're almost like old friends, and when they're there, I'm not thinking about my actual problems." That's the paradox. The drug creates a new set of problems, terrifying hallucinations, but those problems distract from the baseline suffering that feels even worse. The health consequences are severe. We see cognitive impairment, particularly memory problems that persist even when they stop using. We see cardiovascular issues, arrhythmias, elevated blood pressure. We see movement disorders that resemble Parkinson's disease. We see severe dental problems from chronic dry mouth. And the psychiatric effects compound whatever underlying issues were present. Research into chronic diphenhydramine abuse is limited, but what exists paints a concerning picture. A 2018 study published in the Journal of Clinical Psychopharmacology examined a small group of patients who'd been using diphenhydramine daily at doses of 500 to 1,000 milligrams for months or years. Neuropsychological testing showed significant impairments in memory, attention, and executive function compared to matched controls. Brain imaging showed reduced volume in the hippocampus and other regions crucial for memory. The cognitive effects of chronic anticholinergic exposure are particularly concerning given what we know about dementia risk. Multiple large-scale studies have shown that regular use of anticholinergic medications is associated with increased risk of dementia in older adults. Whether this association is causal, whether the drugs actually cause neurodegeneration, or whether it reflects the fact that people with early cognitive decline are more likely to have insomnia and other conditions that lead to anticholinergic use is still debated. But the mechanism is plausible. Chronic blockade of acetylcholine receptors could cause neuronal death or prevent normal repair processes in the brain. For younger people abusing diphenhydramine, the implications are unclear but worrying. Are they causing cumulative brain damage that will manifest as premature cognitive decline? Will the 18-year-old who spends 2 years taking 500 milligrams of diphenhydramine several times a week develop memory problems in their 30s or dementia in their 50s? The longitudinal studies haven't been done because widespread diphenhydramine abuse is a relatively recent phenomenon. We won't know the full long-term consequences for decades. Treatment for diphenhydramine dependence is challenging. There's no medication like methadone or buprenorphine that can substitute for the drug and allow for a controlled taper. The standard approach is behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, motivational interviewing, contingency management, combined with treatment of underlying psychiatric conditions. But success rates are low, particularly for patients with severe mental illness or limited social support. Some treatment programs have reported success with residential programs where patients can be monitored 24/7 and all access to diphenhydramine is eliminated. The first few weeks are difficult. Patients experience a severe psychological craving and often a worsening of the underlying psychiatric symptoms they were medicating. But with intensive support, some patients can get through this period and begin building a life without the drug. The prognosis depends heavily on what support systems and resources are available. A patient with stable housing, supportive family, access to quality mental health care, and no other active substance use disorders has a reasonable chance of recovery. A patient who's homeless, has untreated schizophrenia, and cycles in and out of emergency rooms and jails has a much grimmer outlook. In 2015, a research paper published in JAMA Internal Medicine created shockwaves through both the medical community and the general public. The study, conducted by researchers at the University of Washington, had followed 3,434 adults aged 65 and older for an average of 7 years. None of the participants had dementia at the study's beginning. The researchers tracked all prescription medications the participants took, with particular attention to a class of drugs called anticholinergics, medications that block acetylcholine receptors. The findings were stark and deeply concerning. People who regularly use strong anticholinergic medications, including diphenhydramine, had a significantly elevated risk of developing dementia during the follow-up period. The association was dose-dependent, meaning the more anticholinergic medication people used, and the longer they used it, the higher their risk. Specifically, people who used anticholinergic medications daily for 3 years or more had a 54% increased risk of dementia compared to people who didn't use these medications. For diphenhydramine specifically, the research calculated that taking a standard dose, 25 milligrams daily, for more than 3 years, reached the threshold for significantly increased risk. The study couldn't prove causation. It's possible that people with early undiagnosed cognitive decline were more likely to have sleep problems and other issues that led them to use these medications. But the researchers controlled for many potential confounding factors, and the dose-response relationship, more drugs just more risk, suggested a real causal link. Follow-up studies using brain imaging have added support to the causation hypothesis. Research published in 2016 in JAMA Neurology used MRI and PET scans to examine the brains of older adults taking anticholinergic medications. They found that Anticholinergic use was associated with reduced brain volume, particularly in regions crucial for memory like the hippocampus. They also found reduced glucose metabolism in the brain, suggesting impaired brain function. The biological mechanism makes sense. Acetylcholine is crucial for memory formation and cognitive function. The hippocampus, the brain structure most important for forming new memories, is densely packed with cholinergic neurons. In fact, Alzheimer's disease is characterized in part by degeneration of cholinergic neurons, and many Alzheimer's medications work by preventing the breakdown of acetylcholine, trying to preserve what little cholinergic function remains. If you chronically block acetylcholine receptors with drugs like diphenhydramine, you're essentially creating a reversible chemical version of what happens in Alzheimer's. You're preventing acetylcholine from doing its job. The question is whether this temporary blockade, if repeated consistently over months or years, causes permanent damage. The evidence suggests it might. Animal studies have shown that chronic anticholinergic exposure can cause neuronal death and reduce neurogenesis, the birth of new neurons, in the hippocampus. While animal studies don't always translate perfectly to humans, they provide a plausible mechanism for how these drugs could increase dementia risk. For older adults who had been using diphenhydramine nightly for years as a sleep aid, the 2015 study was devastating news. Many immediately stopped taking the medication. Sales of diphenhydramine-containing sleep aids declined. Doctors began counseling patients to find alternative treatments for insomnia and allergies, particularly in older adults. But what about younger people? What about the teenagers taking massive doses for the Benadryl challenge, or the chronic users consuming 500 to 1,000 milligrams daily? The dementia research focused on older adults taking therapeutic doses for years. It didn't examine young people taking massive doses. We simply don't know what the long-term cognitive effects will be for these populations. The damage could be worse. Younger brains are still developing, and disrupting that development with repeated insults from a neurotoxic substance could have lasting consequences. Or the damage could be less. Younger brains have more capacity for repair and compensation, more neuroplasticity that might allow them to recover from temporary injuries. The honest answer is that we won't know for another 20 or 30 years. When the teenagers doing the Benadryl challenge in 2020 are in their 40s and 50s, then we'll see whether they have higher rates of memory problems and earlier onset of cognitive decline than their peers who didn't abuse diphenhydramine. By then, for many of them, it will be too late to prevent whatever damage has been done. This is the insidious nature of some drug effects. The acute consequences, overdose, emergency room visits, frightening experiences, are immediately visible, but the chronic cumulative consequences take decades to manifest. By the time they become apparent, the damage is irreversible. The Benadryl crisis created a regulatory and policy dilemma with no clear solution. How do you protect people from a substance that is genuinely useful and safe for the vast majority of users, but dangerous when deliberately misused? The regulatory framework in the United States divides drugs into several categories. Controlled substances are divided into schedules or through V, based on their abuse potential and medical utility, with Schedule I being reserved for drugs with high abuse potential and no accepted medical use, like heroin and LSD, and Schedule Vis containing drugs with the lowest abuse potential, like cough medicines with small amounts of codeine. Then there are prescription drugs that aren't controlled substances but require a doctor's authorization. Finally, there are over-the-counter drugs considered safe enough for self-medication without professional supervision. Diphenhydramine has been in that last category since 1946. The decision was based on extensive safety data showing that when used as directed, it posed minimal risk. The therapeutic dose is well below the toxic dose for healthy adults. You would need to deliberately consume an entire bottle to be in serious danger. But this risk assessment assumed rational use. It didn't account for teenagers intentionally overdosing for viral internet fame, or adults with mental illness compulsively consuming massive doses to escape reality. Those scenarios weren't on anyone's radar when diphenhydramine was classified as OTC. Some advocates have called for reclassifying diphenhydramine as prescription only. This would immediately solve the easy access problem. Teenagers couldn't walk into a gas station and buy it. But it would create enormous problems for the millions of people who use it legitimately. It would require doctor visits for simple allergies or occasional insomnia, burdening an already strained healthcare system. It would likely drive many people to use less safe alternatives or to try to obtain diphenhydramine illegally. Others have proposed sales restrictions modelled on pseudoephedrine, the decongestant that was moved behind pharmacy counters in the 2000s when it was discovered that it was being used to manufacture methamphetamine. The Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act of 2005 required pseudoephedrine products to be kept behind the counter, limited purchase quantities, and required buyers to show ID and sign a log. This approach could work for diphenhydramine. Requiring pharmacy counter sales wouldn't prevent legitimate use. Anyone who needed it could still get it. But it would create a barrier to impulsive purchases by teenagers. A pharmacist could refuse sales if they suspected misuse, similar to how many pharmacies now refuse to sell multiple bottles of cough syrup to people suspected of abusing dextromethorphan. But implementing such restrictions is complex. Diphenhydramine is sold under hundreds of brand names and in thousands of products. Standalone allergy medications, sleep aids, cold and flu combinations, motion sickness pills, topical creams. It's sold everywhere from major pharmacy chains to dollar stores to gas stations to online retailers. Creating a comprehensive behind-the-counter requirement would require federal legislation and cooperation from tens of thousands of retail outlets. Some states and individual retailers have voluntarily implemented restrictions. Certain pharmacy chains moved diphenhydramine products behind the counter in areas where abuse was known to be common. Some placed age restrictions or purchase limits. But these are patchwork measures that vary by location and are easily circumvented by going to a different store or buying online. The FDA updated its warnings and required manufacturers to include more prominent information about overdose risks on packaging. In 2020, they mandated that all diphenhydramine products include warnings about the risk of overdose, particularly in children, and information about symptoms of toxicity. Some manufacturers voluntarily reduce the number of pills per package or change packaging to make it less appealing or accessible to children. Johnson & Johnson, which owns the Benadryl brand, launched a public awareness campaign about safe use and the dangers of abuse. They funded educational programs in schools and provided materials to parents and healthcare providers. But a pharmaceutical company is inherently limited in what it can do. Aggressive anti-abuse messaging might imply that their product is dangerous, potentially hurting sales and inviting lawsuits. What's missing is a comprehensive federal response coordinating regulation, education, and treatment. Such a response would require multiple agencies working together, the FDA to regulate sales and labeling, the CDC to track abuse patterns and provide public health guidance, the Department of Education to ensure schools are educating students about these risks, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration to to ensure treatment is available for those who develop problems. But creating such a coordinated response is politically difficult. Diphenhydramine abuse, while serious, kills far fewer people than opioids, alcohol, or tobacco. It's not high on most policymakers' priority lists, and any significant restrictions on availability would face pushback from both the pharmaceutical industry and from legitimate users who don't want their access complicated. So the current situation persists. Diphenhydramine remains widely available. Teenagers continue to abuse it. Emergency rooms continue to see overdoses, and a few people continue to die. It's an acceptable level of risk, apparently, from a societal perspective. Not ideal, but not critical enough to justify major policy changes. This is the dark truth of drug policy. We tolerate a certain amount of harm because the alternatives seem worse or more complicated. We make trade-offs, often implicitly, about whose safety matters more and whose convenience matters more. And in the case of diphenhydramine, we've decided that maintaining easy access for the majority is more important than preventing abuse by a minority. To truly understand diphenhydramine's effects and why they're so disturbing, it's useful to place it in historical context alongside the natural deliriants that humans have been using and fearing for thousands of years. Long before diphenhydramine was synthesized in a Cincinnati laboratory, humans had discovered plants containing tropane alkaloids, naturally occurring anticholinergic compounds that produce deliriant effects identical to what high-dose Benadryl creates. The most infamous of these plants belong to the nightshade family: Datura, jimsonweed, belladonna, deadly nightshade, mandrake, and henbane. These plants appear in the mythology and history of cultures across the globe. In ancient Greece, the oracle at Delphis may have inhaled fumes from burning henbane to induce her prophetic trances. In medieval Europe, flying ointments used by witches allegedly contained extracts of belladonna and other nightshades. Historical accounts suggest that when these ointments were applied to skin, they produced hallucinations of flying, shape-shifting, and attending supernatural gatherings. In the Americas, indigenous peoples used datura in come-of-age rituals and spiritual ceremonies. The Chumash people of California gave adolescent boys datura as part of their initiation into manhood, believing the visions produced by the plant provided spiritual guidance and connection to the supernatural world. But they also recognized its danger. The dose that produced visions was close to the dose that killed, and deaths from datura poisoning were not uncommon. The active compounds in these plants, scopolamine, hyoscyamin, and atropine, are among the most potent anticholinergics found in nature. They produce effects nearly identical to high-dose diphenhydramine: profound confusion, amnesia, convincing hallucinations of insects and phantom figures, repetitive behaviors, dangerous elevation of heart rate and body temperature. Historical accounts of datura intoxication are remarkably similar to modern trip reports of Benadryl abuse. A 17th century account by Robert Beverley describing British soldiers who ate datura in Virginia in 1676 reads like it could have been written today. Some of them ate plentifully of it, the effect of which was a very pleasant comedy, for they turned natural fools upon it for several days. One would blow up a feather in the air, another would dart straws at it with much fury, another stark naked was sitting in a corner like a monkey, grinning and making mows at them. A fourth would fondly kiss and paw his companions. The commonalities between diphenhydramine and natural deliriants extend beyond pharmacology to cultural perception. Throughout history, anticholinergic plants have been associated with danger, witchcraft, and the supernatural. They were not casual recreational drugs. They were powerful, frightening substances used only in specific ritual contexts by people who understood their risks. The knowledge of how to use them safely, to the extent that was possible, was closely guarded and passed down through apprenticeship. But diphenhydramine, despite producing identical effects through identical mechanisms, has none of that cultural baggage. It's sold in a pink bottle with a cheerful label. It's advertised on television. It sits on shelves next to vitamins and bandages. The cognitive dissonance is immense. How can a drugstore allergy medication produce the same terrifying delirium as the devil's trumpet, the witch's weed, the plant that shamans use to speak with spirits? The answer, of course, is that chemistry doesn't care about packaging. A molecule that blocks acetylcholine receptors produces the same effects whether it comes from a plant or a pill, whether it's extracted from nightshade or synthesized in a laboratory, whether it's associated with witchcraft or sold at CVS. This disconnect between the mundane presentation of diphenhydramine and its powerful deliriant effects is part of why abuse has emerged as a problem. If Benadryl were sold as pharmaceutical-grade datura extract, with a label covered in skull and crossbones warnings, fewer people would experiment with it. The benign marketing creates a false sense of safety that encourages risky behavior. We began this investigation with a question. How did a 1940s allergy pill become Gen Z's most dangerous high? As we've seen, the answer is a complex interaction of pharmacology, psychology, technology, and culture. George Reeveshall synthesized diphenhydramine in 1943 as a solution to a real medical problem. For decades, his discovery served exactly that purpose, providing relief to millions of people suffering from allergies and insomnia. It was a pharmaceutical success story, a triumph of scientific ingenuity improving human life. But diphenhydramine's effects extend far beyond blocking histamine. Its powerful anticholinergic properties, useful in some contexts, become dangerous at high doses. For 70 years, this danger remained mostly latent because few people deliberately took massive overdoses. The information about the drug's deliriant effects existed but wasn't widely disseminated. Then came the internet, which democratized access to information about drug effects. Trip reports on sites like Erowid provided detailed accounts of diphenhydramine intoxication, along with dosing information and descriptions of effects. This information spread slowly at first, then explosively with the rise of social media. TikTok's algorithm turned what had been a niche phenomenon into a viral trend. Teenagers who would never have heard of diphenhydramine abuse suddenly saw dozens of videos about the Benadryl challenge. The platform's emphasis on views and engagement created incentives for shocking content, and few things were more shocking than videos of teenagers in the grip of anticholinergic delirium. The result has been a wave of overdoses, hospitalizations, and deaths. Emergency rooms have been forced to develop expertise in managing diphenhydramine toxicity. Parents have had to add over-the-counter medications to the list of substances they need to secure from their teenagers, and the medical community has had to reckon with the fact that one of the most trusted medications in the pharmacopoeia can be profoundly dangerous when misused. The chronic abuse population, adults with mental illness and substance use disorders who use diphenhydramine compulsively, represents a different facet of the same problem. For these individuals, the drug provides escape from unbearable psychological pain, even though that escape takes the form of terrifying hallucinations and confusion. Their abuse is driven by desperation rather than peer pressure, but the consequences are equally severe. The research linking long-term anticholinergic use to increased dementia risk adds another layer of concern. We may be creating a population of young people who will experience premature cognitive decline in middle age as a result of their teenage experimentation with Benadryl. But we won't know the extent of this problem for decades when it's too late to prevent. The regulatory response has been limited and patchwork. Making diphenhydramine prescription only would solve the accessibility problem but create significant burdens for legitimate users. Placing it behind pharmacy counters would help, but requires coordination across thousands of retailers and doesn't address online sales. Education campaigns may reduce experimentation but can't eliminate it entirely. The truth is there's no perfect solution. As long as diphenhydramine is available, and it needs to be available because it serves important medical purposes, some people will abuse it. The question is how we minimize that abuse while preserving access for those who need it. Better education is essential. Teenagers need accurate information about what diphenhydramine actually does at high doses, presented without hyperbole or scare tactics. They need to understand that the experience is not recreational fun, but a medical emergency. Parents need to secure medications and have conversations with their children about social media challenges and why they're dangerous. Better treatment is needed for those who develop problems with chronic use. Addiction and mental health treatment programs need to be aware that diphenhydramine dependence exists and be equipped to address it. And underlying mental health conditions that drive self-medication need to be treated adequately so that people don't turn to dangerous substances seeking relief. Technology platforms bear responsibility too. TikTok and other social media sites need to be more aggressive about removing content that promotes dangerous behaviors while being careful not to suppress legitimate harm reduction information. Their algorithms need to be designed to prevent the viral spread of dangerous challenges. The pharmaceutical industry could do more. Abuse-deterrent formulations are technically possible. Adding substances that cause immediate vomiting at high doses, for instance, though these create their own problems and may not be worth the trade-offs. Ultimately, the Benadryl crisis is a case study in how old substances can create new problems when filtered through new technologies and cultural contexts. Diphenhydramine itself hasn't changed. It's the same molecule Revachol synthesized 80 years ago. What's changed is our information environment, our social structures, and the pressures and anxieties facing young people. The pink bottle in your medicine cabinet is both a lifesaver and a potential killer. That paradox is uncomfortable, but it's the truth we must grapple with. Diphenhydramine will continue to be used, both properly and improperly. More people will benefit from it. More people will be harmed by it. The story doesn't end here. It's being written right now in emergency rooms where doctors treat overdoses, in homes where parents talk to their teenagers about drug challenges, in laboratories where researchers study long-term cognitive effects, in government offices where policymakers debate how to respond. The shadow people that diphenhydramine users see aren't real. But the danger is, and acknowledging that danger, understanding it, and responding to it thoughtfully and effectively is the responsibility of all of us, medical professionals, parents, educators, policymakers, and the users themselves. Thank you for staying with me through this deep investigation. If this has changed how you think about over-the-counter medications, if it's made you more aware of what's in your medicine cabinet and who has access to it, if it's given you information that might help keep someone safe, then it has served its purpose. Share this with parents, with teachers, with anyone who works with young people. The more people who understand this issue, the more lives we can save. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and remember, just because you can buy it at a gas station doesn't mean it's harmless. The hallucinations aren't real, but the damage is.